There are a lot of amazing anime OSTs out there, and a lot of amazing composers behind them. But ever since I first started getting into anime, Kevin Penkin has always been my absolute favorite. From his breakout hit in the soundtrack to Made in Abyss, all the way till his most recent scores for Apothecary Diaries and Star Wars Visions, I've listened to pretty much every soundtrack that he's put out over the last 10 years. Most of his soundtracks are pretty universally acclaimed. However, I still think his artistry has flown under a lot of people's radars. And so in this video, I want to go through my favorite soundtracks that Kevin Penkin has ever made, and talk about a few of the many things that make his music so incredible. So for the purposes of this video, I'll be talking about my 5 absolute favorite Kevin Penkin OSTs. Just some general rules, I'm going to be including soundtracks for various seasons under one single umbrella. In the case that one season's soundtrack is better than the others, I'll be sure to mention that, but if I included them all individually, I think this list would be pretty boring. Anyways, let's get into it. This one is a little bit of a surprising pick, but I think that the Baan soundtrack is really incredible. If you guys haven't heard, the YouTuber Giguk recently produced a fully original anime film titled Baan, which is available right here on YouTube. It's a really well done short film, and Kevin Penkin was the one responsible for scoring the entire short. And this soundtrack is so good. Like sincerely, if you haven't heard it yet, I cannot recommend it enough. The first song on the album gives me chills every time I hear it. Baan is meant to be a love letter to Southeast Asian, specifically Thai, culture. And along with that goal, the film is about the themes of family, growing up, and finding your place in the world. While the instrumentation is for the most part fairly standard, the soundtrack to Baan does a few things that make it perfect for the film. For one, in addition to the strings and piano that the soundtrack uses, it sounds like Baan features a Thai flute known as the klui as the lead instrument for a couple major songs. While this may not have been the exact instrument used, the sound is remarkably similar, and I can't imagine that it wasn't intentional with Baan's other Thai influences. The use of this very distinctive Southeast Asian instrument elevates Baan's soundtrack so much. It gives a feeling of authenticity to the soundtrack with its commitment to exploring a Southeast Asian setting. And in addition to that, the melodies and motifs of this OST fit so perfectly with the core themes of the anime. The wistful yet fantastical score adds to the feelings of melancholy present in the short, while still not taking away from how magical and wondrous some aspects of this world are. I think in terms of individual songs, Baan deserves a way higher placement. The main theme and Homebird are just really gorgeous even outside of the anime they're attached to, but unfortunately this soundtrack is extremely short, only 10 total tracks if we're not counting the instrumental versions of some of the main songs. And this just makes it hard to place the soundtrack higher than some of the later ones, despite its instrumental complexity and overall quality. Even still, I really enjoyed Baan. I listened to these songs pretty darn often on my own time, and I almost teared up the first time I reached the ending of the short. Florence is one of the most incredible scores I have ever heard in my entire life. It delivers a gut-wrenching amount of emotion through a surprisingly simple soundtrack. Honestly, if this was just a list of personal preference, Florence would probably have been at the very top, but I tried to factor other things into my ranking, such as the soundtrack's length, complexity, and overall uniqueness. Compared to some of the lighter soundtracks that I'll be talking about, Florence only falls this far due to its shorter track length and simple instrumentation, but that doesn't mean I like it any less. Most of Florence's soundtrack is a duet between a piano and one other instrument, and its arrangements are just wonderful. Almost every song embodies this beautiful mix of melancholy and wonder, which reflects the theme of the game so perfectly. As someone who first finished listening to the soundtrack the year before I went off to college, the mood and tone of these songs was so perfectly in tune with the sentiments I had towards life. The wistfulness for times that were simpler and more joyous, as well as the cautious optimism towards what the future could be. And all of this is captured through the movement of usually just 2 instruments. And at least in my interpretation, the specific instrumentation of the songs actually has thematic meaning in the story too. As the 2 main characters get closer, the duets get more and more in sync, with Happy Together being a joyous ballad where the piano and cello interweave into some really beautiful melodies. And then, as the pair's relationship takes a turn for the worse, we get to the aptly titled song Fight, where the piano and cello almost refuse to play together, playing segmented, aggressive measures against one another. And all of this meaning and depth is packed into 20 fairly short songs. Again, I cannot praise this soundtrack enough, and if it wasn't for the complexity and magnitude of some of the later scores, I would definitely have it higher up. But as it stands, Florence is still an incredible soundtrack. And if you were curious, my favorite songs on it are Dream and Happy Together. Coming in a little lower than you may at first expect is the soundtrack to Made in Abyss. Just looking at Kevin Penkin's most popular songs, you can pretty clearly tell what the fan favorite is. And honestly, I fully understand why. Despite being the first of Kevin Penkin's full-length anime soundtracks, the soundtrack to Made in Abyss Season 1 still has such a distinct identity. It pioneered the sound that came to define Made in Abyss as a whole, with fantastical orchestral sections playing across from deep and haunting synths. This dichotomy of sound came to mirror the tone of the actual series itself, with the Abyss being an entity that inspires a deep feeling of wonder and fear in the same breath. The reason that this isn't my favorite of Kevin Penkin's OST is quite simply because I think the first Made in Abyss soundtrack is just a bit worse than the soundtracks for Season 2 and the movie. It's not noticeable if you listen to Season 1 by itself, but the moment you start comparing the soundtrack to later seasons, you'll start to see what I mean. The overall level of polish just goes way up as you get to his more recent work. And this isn't meant to dunk on Season 1's OST at all. At this point, it's over 8 years old and was one of Kevin Penkin's first works, so it's only natural that his style has improved over the years. And while the soundtrack to Season 1 will always have a very special place in my heart, I think that the second and third Made in Abyss OSTs are almost perfect. The level of consistency in every song is so incredible. While in Made in Abyss 1, there were a couple songs I could tell were only meant to accompany certain scenes in the anime, pretty much every song in the next two OSTs stand alone as a beautiful piece. The first 10 songs in the second Made in Abyss soundtrack are all incredible in their own unique way. And in addition to the overall consistency in every track, the soundtracks only get more experimental as time goes on. And I love that. While Made in Abyss 1 was just starting to dip its toes into experimenting with synths and classic orchestral tracks, Made in Abyss 2 and 3 dive in head first. The rumble of scientific triumph is the theme that plays during the climax of the Made in Abyss movie, and it hits so hard. The combination of the synth bass, the low brass, and the haunting detuned vocals make for an incredible track, both in addition to the sequence in the movie and as a standalone song. And Made in Abyss Season 2 goes even further, with almost every song having unique instrumentation that makes it stand alone. I Am Burning Man is a great example of this, because the song is basically a full synthwave track for seemingly no reason. Overall, I really love the Made in Abyss soundtracks, and even the first season's OST, which I have some complaints about, would still easily make it into my top 5 list. But the two soundtracks I have above this one do manage to do certain things which I think make them a bit more noteworthy. So without further ado, let's get into the penultimate soundtrack. So, I actually didn't realize that Kevin Penkin had done the soundtrack for Apothecary Diaries, since the OST for Seasons 1 and 2 were a joint project between 3 composers. But the moment the first track that Kevin Penkin was responsible for came on, I could instantly recognize his style. The one and only issue I have with the soundtrack is that I wish Kevin Penkin had more songs on it. That is to say that this album is basically perfect. Apothecary Diaries is set in a version of Imperial China during the reign of the fictional country of Li. And in addition to it just being incredible to listen to, the instrumentation of the Apothecary Diaries soundtrack is perfect for this setting. In addition to the string sections and piano, I was able to pick out a number of traditional Chinese instruments, such as the zhao, a simple vertical flute, the erhu, a 2-stringed bowed instrument, and the guzheng, a large plucked string instrument, among a couple others. These traditional instruments bring about a very fitting musical flair to the songs in the soundtrack, and it's very clear that in addition to their authenticity, Kevin Penkin knows how to make them sound good. The melodies and motifs present in this soundtrack harken back to classic uses of these instruments, but with appropriate twists to suit the more Western backing instruments of the piano and strings. Even just the piano and strings by themselves make for an incredible soundtrack, but the moment these traditional instruments join the ensemble, this OST becomes perfect. In addition to how incredibly on point the instrumentation is, the overall level of quality in these songs is really hard to match. Each and every one of these pieces is just wonderful to listen to, and there's hardly a single one that I choose to skip when listening to the OST as a whole. And on top of that, these songs add to some of the most memorable scenes in the anime, to the point that listening to them individually instantly reminds me of some of my favorite moments of Apothecary Diaries. As I said, the only reason this soundtrack isn't number 1 is because of its collaborative nature, and because there's one other soundtrack that's equally impressive in my opinion. When making this list of soundtracks, I kinda started to doubt my own placements. The Made in Abyss OST is so dear to my heart, and the soundtrack to Apothecary Diaries became an instant classic to me. But after re-listening to it for a bit, I think the Spice and Wolf soundtrack is incredible. I've actually never seen Spice and Wolf, despite hearing a lot of good things about it. But as soon as Kevin Penkin released the soundtrack to this season, I listened to it pretty much instantly. And I cannot tell you how much I immediately fell in love with this OST. All of the same points I made about the Apothecary Diaries soundtrack pretty much also apply here. Spice and Wolf is apparently set in Western Europe sometime in the 14 or 1500s, and the instrumentation of the entire soundtrack is perfectly geared to fit that setting. I was able to pick out some fiddles, dulcimers, and even what sounded like Uilleann pipes or bagpipes. These are all instruments that have traditionally been used to score fantasy movies or shows, however, they all have origins in European countries such as Germany, Norway, and Ireland. In general, this soundtrack maintains a very specific tone that's somewhere between high fantasy and folk music. Every line of instrumentation in this soundtrack feels a little clumsy in a deeply human way. And from what little I know about Spice and Wolf, this complements the setting and mood of the show, with a lot of the anime focusing on simple, down-to-earth character drama and small-scale commerce. To add to the unique instrumentation, this soundtrack also uses some really specific percussion instruments that make it feel appropriate to this fictional setting. Instead of using drums and more classic orchestral percussion instruments, almost every percussion track in Spice and Wolf uses some really simple wood instruments and shakers. The drumline in It's All Economics, for example, sounds like a single person tapping on a hollow barrel or table. This choice really adds to the cozy folk music feel of the soundtrack. One of the songs even uses a jaw harp, which is an instrument that literally nobody has ever heard of outside of the context of old folk songs. Just overall, the dedication to the mood and tone of the setting is so impressive in Spice and Wolf soundtrack, and honestly, I'm kind of shocked that more people haven't commented on it. I haven't seen the show, so it's possible that the OST is poorly utilized or mixed badly, but just listening to some of these tracks by themselves, I feel like this is at least on par with Kevin Penkin's contribution to Apothecary Diaries. And even in consistency, almost every track is really enjoyable to listen to. This is pretty much my go-to soundtrack whenever I want to study or get work done. And unlike Apothecary Diaries, Kevin Penkin made a total of 66 songs for the show, so you really aren't lacking in variety either. I'm really shocked that Kevin Penkin hasn't won any more awards for his soundtrack work recently. He won Best Score at the Anime Awards for Tower of God and Made in Abyss, but ever since 2020, he's only been nominated once. And honestly, I don't think this fairly represents the quality of his work over the past few years. Despite how fondly I think of Made in Abyss's OST, I have to say that I think his more recent work has improved by leaps and bounds, to the point that Spice and Wolf and Apothecary Diaries, two of his most recent soundtracks, have quickly become my favorite soundtracks that he's ever done. While I would love to see Kevin Penkin win another award for the work that he does, I wanted to at least make a video highlighting the quality of his work. I'm sure everyone has different opinions as to which of his soundtracks is your favorite, and I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. There's really no wrong answer. Thank you so much for watching.